Imagine for a moment that a stranger has been living in your house without your knowledge, secretly influencing your moods, your decisions, even your sense of who you are. Now imagine that stranger is your own unconscious mind. This is the provocative idea put forth by psychologist Timothy D. Wilson in his book Strangers to Ourselves. He argues that our minds contain hidden depths we're unaware of, an adaptive unconscious that perceives, interprets, evaluates, and acts without our conscious permission. The reality is that the unconscious mind is not a passive place where we store memories and drives, as Freud originally theorized, but an active, intelligent system that sizes up our environments in milliseconds, processes far more information than the conscious mind can handle, and deftly navigates the world without our conscious input. As unsettling as it may be to acknowledge, we are in many ways strangers to ourselves, guided by an unconscious entity that is both indispensable and impossible to fully know. If you've ever found yourself reacting emotionally to something before you consciously understood why, that's a sign your adaptive unconscious was one step ahead. If you've ever been surprised by your own behavior, procrastinating on a project for no apparent reason, for instance, or falling for someone you didn't expect to fall for, that's your adaptive unconscious asserting itself, responding to circumstances based on its own agenda. As we'll see, tuning into the hidden workings of your unconscious won't magically reveal your true self to you on a platter. The adaptive unconscious is too complex and elusive for that. But by studying the clues it leaves in our everyday thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, we can begin to construct a more complete, authentic picture of human nature. One that accounts for the strangers within us as well as the selves we consciously know. The unconscious is smarter than you think. Before diving into the nitty-gritty of how the unconscious works, it's worth addressing a common misconception: the idea that the unconscious is a primitive, unsophisticated system, incapable of the higher-order intelligence we associate with conscious. This view is outdated and inaccurate. Research in cognitive psychology over the past few decades has revealed that the unconscious mind is a supremely efficient, adaptive machine, able to process and respond to an incredible amount of information in the blink of an eye. Your senses are taking in over 11 million bits of information per second. That includes every photon of light hitting your retinas, every subtle change in air pressure detected by your ears, every shift in body position signaled by your nerve endings. If you had to consciously perceive and process all that data, you'd be so overwhelmed you wouldn't be able to function. Luckily, your adaptive unconscious handles the bulk of that input on your behalf. Outside of conscious awareness, it sifts through that 11 million bit deluge and flags only the most relevant information for your conscious consideration. That's why you can concentrate on reading this sentence even though your peripheral vision is picking up all sorts of distractions in the area around these words. Not only does the unconscious absorb sensory cues with astounding efficiency, it's also lightning fast at interpreting those cues, using sophisticated pattern recognition to tell us what they mean. Your unconscious can differentiate a friend from a potential foe in milliseconds, based on subliminally detected facial cues, before your conscious mind has even registered there's a person in front of you. What's more, the unconscious is a master at learning complex information and drawing inferences, without your conscious participation. In one study, researchers asked participants to predict where an X would appear on a computer screen by pressing a corresponding button. What the participants didn't know was that the X's position on each trial followed a highly elaborate mathematical rule involving multiple interacting factors, determined by where the X had been on the last several trials. Consciously trying to figure out such a convoluted pattern would be virtually impossible. Despite not being able to articulate the pattern, the participants got faster and faster at predicting the X's location over time. Their unconscious minds were figuring out the rule and using it to improve performance, without the conscious mind ever catching on. The adaptive unconscious is also a source of meaningful goals, preferences, and intuitions that can go up against our rational judgments. In another study, researchers had participants choose an art poster to take home, after either analyzing their reasons for liking or disliking each one, or going with their gut. Those who made a snap judgment ended up happier with their choice of poster than those who evaluated the pros and cons. Conscious analysis, it seems, can lead us astray from what we truly want on an intuitive level. The adaptive unconscious has its own emotional standards. The divided self. So we have these two systems, a conscious self and an adaptive unconscious, working in tandem to steer us through life. What's the relationship between them? Do they always pull in the same direction, Or are there times when they end up at cross purposes? Evidence suggests it's very possible for our unconscious and conscious selves to be misaligned. Like a wayward horse and rider, the unconscious can stray from the path our conscious has selected, pursuing its own impulses, preferences, and goals. Wilson argues that we have a conscious self-concept, the autobiographical story we tell about who we are, what we value, and what we're capable of. Then we have an unconscious self that develops its own personality traits, emotional proclivities, and characteristic ways of interpreting the world, without our conscious awareness. When the conscious self-concept doesn't match the unconscious self, we can find ourselves behaving in puzzling, self-defeating ways that contradict the image we have of ourselves. You might consider yourself a calm, even-keeled person, rarely prone to anger. But if your unconscious has a hair-trigger response to perceived slights, you can find yourself lashing out in defensive rage before your conscious mind knows what's happening. Or, you may pride yourself consciously on being assertive and self-assured. But if your unconscious is gripped by rejection sensitivity, always scanning for signs of social threat, you can find yourself holding back and self-censoring despite your consciously cultivated persona. Biases built up over childhood and hardened into habit can become so automatized that they shape your unconscious responses even as your conscious mind disavows them. Consciously, you may hold egalitarian, non-prejudiced views of other races and social groups. But in the heat of the moment, when there's no time to reflect, your unconscious may default to implicit stereotypes and associations you'd consciously reject. The potential for contradiction between the conscious and unconscious self starts early in development. Studies show that infants and young children make social judgments and exhibit goal-directed behavior long before they have the cognitive wherewithal to understand what they're doing. In one experiment, 15-month-olds watched an adult place 2 toys on a table, then reach for one of them repeatedly, as if trying to grab it. The adult never succeeded in grasping the toy, presumably because it was out of reach. Later on, when given the chance to select one of the toys themselves, the infants were more likely to choose the one the adult had reached for. Their adaptive unconscious had apparently intuited the adult's goal, and was now guiding them to pursue that same goal themselves. The infants couldn't possibly explain their choice, but some part of their minds had registered the social cue and filed it away as meaningful. As we grow up, we develop more sophisticated theories about our own personalities and what makes us tick. But those theories don't always align with the unconscious machinery directing our actions behind the scenes. In another study, researchers measured college students' conscious self-concepts, as well as their unconscious personality traits, goals, and emotional dispositions, using more indirect assessments. There was hardly any correlation between the two. Students who described themselves as motivated primarily by a desire to help and connect with others often scored high on unconscious measures of the need for power and control. Consciously, they saw themselves one way. Unconsciously, they operated by different drives. Wilson argues it's this very lack of access to our own adaptive unconscious that necessitates the construction of a conscious self-concept in the first place. Since we can't perceive the actual reasons for our thoughts, feelings, and actions, we come up with plausible theories to explain them. Theories that paint us in a generally positive light and give us a sense of consistency. But those self-flattering stories, however comforting, are at best an approximation, a rough sketch of our actual interior worlds. To know ourselves more fully and authentically, we must learn to read between the lines of our conscious self-concepts and interpret the hidden ink of the adaptive unconscious. The problem with introspection. All this talk of an inaccessible unconscious may be disheartening if you put a lot of stock in introspection. Many of us assume that if we reflect hard enough on why we do what we do, we'll arrive at genuine self-insight. But Wilson argues that much of what drives us simply isn't available to the conscious mind, no matter how much mental energy we expend. The adaptive unconscious is like a computer's operating system. It's so fundamental to the workings of the machine that it can't be easily opened up and examined. It's the background software that keeps everything running smoothly, but you have limited ability to tinker with its underlying commands. That's not to say introspection is worthless. Consciously reflecting on our lives can yield valuable insights and self-knowledge. But it's important to recognize the method's constraints. Because we have no direct pipeline to the unconscious, our conscious theories about ourselves frequently miss the mark, no matter how sincere our efforts at soul-searching. In a series of experiments, for instance, Wilson and his colleagues asked people to analyze the reasons behind their attitudes on various topics. Why they felt the way they did about a romantic partner, or what explained their preferences in art and music. What he found was that people's rational explanations often had little to do with what actually shaped their feelings and judgments. They might insist they loved their partner because of his kindness and intelligence, but measures of implicit attraction showed they were attuned to much more superficial traits, like his looks and social status, without realizing. Similarly, people who thought they disliked an abstract painting because the colors were too bland were actually responding negatively to the awkward positioning of the shapes, an aspect of composition they'd never consciously considered. Even more disturbingly, Wilson found that people's faulty self-analyses could sometimes alter their underlying preferences. Asked to explain why they felt the way they did about a romantic partner or roommate, participants zeroed in on reasons that sounded plausible, but were in fact largely irrelevant, like he has good manners, or he's very organized. In the process of generating these bogus reasons, they actually talked themselves into a new set of conscious feelings that contradicted their initial gut reactions. By trying to verbalize the ineffable, they warped it. Wilson called this the introspection illusion, mistaken belief that self-reflection always illuminates what's really going on inside us. All too often, the conscious mind just doesn't have the information it needs to accurately explain its own judgments, feelings, and actions. The truth is, we can stare inward until we're blue in the face and still not glimpse the unconscious machinations that animate so much of who we are. To truly get to know the stranger within, we need an indirect approach, looking out to see in. So how can we turn the introspection illusion to our advantage and get a clearer sense of our unconscious depths? Paradoxically, one of the most effective ways to discover your inner self is to observe your outer self as it moves through the world. Rather than treating introspection as a quest for buried treasure, as something we can accomplish through sheer force of mental will, Wilson suggests treating it like a mystery we can only solve by gathering clues. And many of those clues lie not in the perseverative thoughts we churn through trying to figure ourselves out, but in our observable actions and their impact on others. After all, the adaptive unconscious may be inaccessible to the conscious mind, but it leaves a trail of breadcrumbs in our everyday behaviors. By paying attention to those breadcrumbs, we can start to infer what the unconscious is up to, even if we can't directly interrogate it. If you want to know your true values, for instance, look at where you spend your time and attention. Maybe you tell yourself that creativity is your highest priority, but if you're always putting off that passion project to scroll through social media, that's a sign your unconscious values are pulling you in a different direction. If you want to know your real romantic requirements, look at the characteristics your partners tend to share across multiple relationships. You may have a conscious type you pursue, but your unconscious attractions will show up in the flesh and blood people you actually select. If you want to assess your social skills, look at how people respond to you in real-world interactions. Their nonverbal reactions will often tell you more than their words, and more than your inner voice of self-assurance or self-doubt. Of course, interpreting these external cues is an imperfect art. There's always the risk of projecting our conscious biases onto our behavior and misreading what it says about our unconscious. But by treating your actions as observable data, rather than relying purely on inner sensations, you're at least working with more objective information. And you can take that approach a step further by soliciting an outside perspective. Because so much of yourself is tied up in how you impact the people around you, their insights can be revelatory. Trusted friends and family may pick up on imbalances between your conscious self-presentation and your unconscious demeanor, for instance. Maybe you see yourself as calm and laid back, but to others you come off as seething with unspoken stress. Or maybe you pride yourself on being an intellectual, but your coworkers know you as the guy who's always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. Getting that kind of candid social feedback can sting, but it can also be a vital guide to the blind spots in your self-knowledge. The areas where your inner sense of who you are is misaligned with the signals you're sending. As long as you consider multiple perspectives, not just one potentially skewed take, external assessments are a powerful tool for cross-referencing your conscious self-concept and keeping it in touch with reality. Getting to know the stranger within isn't comfortable. It requires acknowledging that your conscious self-portrait is incomplete, that it's missing essential truths about your inner nature, truths you can only approximate through observation and inference. But the alternative is even more unsettling, going through life beholden to an unwitting puppet master, an unconscious agenda setter whose influence you can't account for. By endeavoring to understand your adaptive unconscious, even in limited ways, you open up the possibility of a more authentic, integrated self. Yes, we are all divided against ourselves to some degree, our minds partitioned into conscious and unconscious spheres. But by looking outward to better see inward, by using our actions as a window into our deeper dispositions and drives, we can bridge that gap and achieve a fuller picture of human nature, in ourselves and others. In the end, the adaptive unconscious will always retain some mystery, some unreachable core. But the more we respect its power and attune to its influence, the closer we come to true self-knowledge, and the better equipped we are to make conscious choices in harmony with our unconscious realities. We may be strangers to ourselves, but we can, with humility and patience, befriend the stranger within.